Booker, are you afraid of God?
No. But I'm afraid of you.
Bioshock made a tremendous splash in the video game industry when it released in 2007. In the wake of such a bombshell, expectations were understandably high for a follow-up. Bioshock 2 was released in 2010 to satisfy this demand. While I disagree with the assessment, it was seen by many to be a lesser game because creative director Ken Levine and his studio Irrational Games didn't play a part in Bioshock 2's development. The recycling of the now stale Rapture setting, coupled with familiar gameplay and themes, contributed to the idea that the series was merely treading water, without pushing itself forward. It turned out that Levine and team had a good reason for sitting out Bioshock 2. They were hard at work on an incredibly ambitious secret sequel of their own. If demand for the true successor to Bioshock hadn't been satiated by 2K Marin's release, fans weren't left disappointed for long. Mere months after the release of Bioshock 2, the father of the franchise came out of hiding and announced a bold new vision for the series. Unsurprisingly, given its ambition, the game suffered a messy development with numerous delays, which I remember all too well, as I was at this point one of the many rabid fans eagerly awaiting the chance to experience all Bioshock Infinite had to offer. That day finally arrived in March 2013, and I distinctly remember racing home from high school each day to soak up more of the story and world in what would quickly become one of my most memorable gaming experiences. I didn't get into the Bioshock franchise until a year or two after the release of Bioshock 2, so Infinite holds a special place in my heart because I experienced all the hype and anticipation firsthand. It wasn't just me who got caught up in all the excitement. Bioshock Infinite received widespread acclaim and dominated the awards season that year, alongside Naughty Dog's The Last of Us and Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto V. The original Bioshock helped to kickstart the Xbox 360 PS3 generation, and Bioshock Infinite bookended it as one of the generation's swan songs. With all that being said, now a decade removed, let's put aside all its hype, expectations, and reputation for now, and just give Bioshock Infinite an honest critical assessment. Before getting into my thoughts on the game, I want to preface this video by saying I really do love Bioshock Infinite. If you talked to me back in 2013, I would have praised the game to high heaven and ranked it as one of my favorites of all time. However, in the numerous playthroughs that followed, the game has begun to feel more shallow, and many flaws that once lay hidden have risen to the surface. My criticisms in this video are likely going to come across harshly, which is why I wanted to make this clear up front. I don't want you to get the impression that I hate Bioshock Infinite. Despite how it might sound, I still love it, warts and all. I'm this critical because I hold this game, and the surrounding Bioshock series, incredibly close, and want it to be the best it can possibly be. As I'll explain in excruciating detail, Bioshock Infinite is one of the worst examples of missed potential I've ever experienced. What we got is great, no doubt about it, but it could have been one for the ages. At the risk of diminishing the game's successes, I find it more interesting to dig into the game's shortcomings and what holds it back from that incredible potential.
Excuse me. How much longer?
I'm going to organize this video around the structure of the game's progression, but will often jump off onto other tangential subjects I'd like to discuss. I've found this to be an effective method. Hopefully you'll agree. We've got to start our discussion somewhere, and it makes the most sense to start with the boldest change Infinite brought to the Bioshock series. As incredible a setting as it is, after 2 games, 2.5 if you count Minerva's Den, Rapture was starting to grow stale, and if Infinite was going to truly wow its audience, something novel was required. Enter Columbia. The game starts familiarly enough with a lighthouse out at sea, but rather than descending below the ocean, you are rocketed above the clouds. Just like Rapture before it, Columbia is the cornerstone of Bioshock Infinite. The game would be nothing without it. Wide open walkways beneath a brilliantly blue sky couldn't be a sharper contrast to the depressingly dark, claustrophobic corridors of Rapture. Eventually, the 2 cities are revealed to be more similar than they initially appear, but at least on the surface, you couldn't have asked for a better breath of fresh air. During Infinite's opening hours, the player is treated to a tour of Columbia in its prime. And, at least for me, It's eye-wateringly beautiful. The entrance to the city lies within a temple dedicated to the leading family of Columbia, founder Father Comstock, the Lady Comstock, and their holy child, the Lamb of Columbia. In all the years since Infinite's release, I don't think I've seen a better aesthetic mix of color and music in a game. The saturated tones staining the glass and bouncing off the reflecting pool, coupled with the wonderful rendition of the traditional hymn, Will the Circle Be Unbroken, makes an incredible first impression. After a mandatory baptism to enter the city proper, the glorious feast for the eyes doesn't let up. It's not just simple eye candy, however. This peaceful walk through the Garden of New Eden reveals much about the values of Columbia. You can listen in on the still sane citizens and find their musings far more coherent than those of the Splicers. The courtyard is dominated by massive statues of the Holy Trinity, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin, proclaiming the strength behind the sword, key, and scroll, or strength, industry, and law. This leads right into the bustle of the annual Columbia Fair, celebrating the secession from the United States of America. There is so much cheer in the air that I find myself always eager to return to these peaceful opening scenes, but you can already feel the cracks forming beneath the surface. If something seems too good to be true, it always is. I really appreciate how much interactivity there is at the fair. It's so full of life. Whether it's a shooting minigame or a performing folk music group, every direction you turn there is something bright and flashy to check out. We're reintroduced to the Lutesses here, and I have to pause for that as they are a true bright spot in the game. These two are shrouded in mystery and pop up whenever you least expect it with a trademark quirkiness. All you really know at this point is that they are the bodies that instigated the events that are taking place by sending Booker to Columbia. It doesn't seem to be the first time these events have taken place either. Like the narrator of The Twilight Zone, they give the impression of omniscience and always existing outside the bounds of the game world. Many of their secrets are eventually uncovered by the game's conclusion, but the air of intrigue and mystery never fully dissipates. We begin to uncover the true nature of Columbia when Booker pulls the unlucky number 77 at the raffle, and exposes himself as the false shepherd. While Rapture was founded on capitalistic individualism, Columbia's origins lie in a nasty combination of American exceptionalism and religious zealotry. The founders are the party in power, filled to the brim with ultra-nationalism for their country and unwavering loyalty to their divine leader, Father Comstock. The founders eagerly anticipate the day when the Lamb of Columbia is destined to lead them on a destructive cleansing of the Sodom below. The prophet's visions of the future actually seem to have some ground to them, as his warnings of a false shepherd, with aims to lead the lamb astray, are eerily prescient down to the mark on his hand. Once outed as this false shepherd, Booker immediately jumps to the top of Columbia's most wanted list. Also opposing the founders are the underground revolutionaries, the Vox Populi. Formed out of the working class and the segregated races within Columbia, the Vox oppose everything that the founders stand for, and aren't going to stop at peaceful protest. As the game progresses, it becomes more and more apparent that conflict is brewing, until it inevitably breaks out in a terrible civil war. As you escape to the rooftops of Columbia, the dark side of the city is further exposed. The sharp contrast with the bright and cheery city square is like night and day, and I find it just delectable. The best example of the darkness below the surface of Columbia lies in the headquarters of the Order of the Raven. This extremist group don't disguise their racism, and the degree to which this is shown is deliciously shocking. The painting of a heroic John Wilkes Booth taking down the devilish emancipator is extremely memorable. This order might be the most outspoken against the dilution of America's white heritage, but racism runs rampant throughout all of Columbia. You'll also run past Negro cages and the trashed homes of black sympathizers on the streets. I'm glad Infinite doesn't cower from these unpleasant realities straight out of our own world, and the use of racist iconography strikes the right balance of being shocking without venturing into tasteless territory. Everyone will react differently, of course, but I think most players will be made uncomfortable with what plays out on screen, but never hurt or offended. As far as the actual level design of this area goes, the rooftops are one of the better levels at rewarding exploration, which should strike an ominous note for the rest of the game. There are several fully realized buildings that could easily be skipped over if you aren't observant. As the game goes on, these buildings that you can actually enter become more and more uncommon, so enjoy it while you can. The highlight of your ascent to Monument Island is the first encounter with Comstock. You've already learned a ton about him from the propaganda littering the city and the chatter of its denizens, but having a direct conversation with him is a new development. I love the 1984 style projection. Comstock's chilling presence is felt even in that likeness. His mighty influence over his followers is clearly demonstrated when he simply commands them to stand down so that he can have a chat with the false shepherd. The prophet shows that he knows Booker even deeper than Booker knows himself, and warns him to stay clear of his lamb. When Booker doesn't back down, Father Comstock strikes out with nothing but the word of the prophet, and Booker narrowly escapes with his life. This brief encounter really builds Comstock up as a force to be reckoned with. There can be no doubt that this city lies completely under his thumb. Once you reach Monument Tower itself, the game really teases out the build-up to Elizabeth. While the exterior acts as a beacon of hope for Columbia's future, the interior of the tower is all function. Due to her future role as Comstock's successor and Columbia's battle leader, Elizabeth is revered by the city. However, the few who actually know Elizabeth and understand the extent of her powers are downright terrified of her, and the entire island exists to conceal, imprison, and study her. At an early age, she exhibited the profound ability to open tears to alternate universes, and has since had her powers dampened with a siphon and remained locked up under careful study. The poor girl doesn't know anything outside the walls of her tower, and the tiny glimpses of other worlds teased by her tears. Upon getting your first glimpse of her through a series of one-way mirrors, it's hard not to immediately sympathize. She presents as nothing more than a typical teenage girl, but is treated as a zoo animal at best, a nuclear bomb at worst. I adore this little hint of her tear-opening abilities. There are so many little touches. For one, it's very effective at building up her character, showing us that she is a romantic at heart. Her heart pines for Paris in particular, but she isn't quite able to control the tears. If you pay attention to the details, it really opens up your mind to what tears mean. Infinite takes place in 1912, yet Star Wars is playing in the cinema, and Tears for Fears is playing on the radio. One of my favorite songs, by the way. The cinema ticker advertises Revenge of the Jedi, the original title for the third Star Wars movie that was changed just prior to release. Tiny details like this being changed should get your mind working as to the direction this story could go in. In the prior Bioshock games, important NPCs were nearly always kept at arm's reach behind glass to disguise their shoddy animation work. This obviously wouldn't have been possible with how large a role Elizabeth is to play in Infinite, but it's incredibly impressive how much they stepped up their animation game. The work done on Elizabeth is truly industry-leading material. The Disney princess inspiration here is obvious. Her colorful character design with those big expressive eyes fits her childlike naivete and optimism. Just like with Rapunzel, this bubbly personality doesn't really fit someone who has had little to no social interaction in her entire life, but the writers aim to make her likable, and it's a nitpick that's easily ignored with how strongly they succeeded on that front. A locked-up princess wouldn't be complete without a dragon to guard her tower, and that brings us to Songbird. Elizabeth has a complicated relationship with this mechanized bird-like creature. Manufactured to protect her from outside threats and to keep her inside, he's a constant source of frustration for Elizabeth, but also the closest thing she has to a friend. Songbird is clearly intelligent and is fiercely protective of the girl, meaning he doesn't take kindly to Booker's intrusion. Bioshock Infinite really excels at these first-person choreographed action sequences. They are a little more than cutscenes, but it's nevertheless thrilling to race down the skyline with Songbird circling in the background. I could rave about how awesome his design is for days, and I love how his protector role over Elizabeth mirrors the big daddy, little sister dynamic in Rapture. Speaking of parallels, it's a bit weird that Elizabeth and Eleanor from Bioshock 2, both superpowered teenage girls worshipped as a holy vessel for salvation by their city, are also both referred to as the Lamb. That's definitely going a bit too far with the similarities, and if players were as familiar with the story of Bioshock 2 as they are with Bioshock 1 or Infinite, I think this would be a common criticism. After waking up in Battleship Bay, we get a nice return to the non-hostile exploration style of the opening hours. I really wish there was more of this in the game. It's so much fun to soak everything in and just live in such a well-realized world. I love the Dimwit and Duke puppet sketches, teaching the boys and girls of Columbia to be good little patriots. With how intimately Comstock seems to know Booker, I wouldn't put it past him to intentionally rhyme dimwit with DeWitt. as another layer of conditioning in preparation for the false shepherd's arrival. Interacting with the environment and the NPCs is even more entertaining with the addition of Elizabeth. The way she organically mingles about and comments on this whole new world is so lifelike. It makes the other Columbia denizens feel downright lifeless and antiquated in comparison. Elizabeth is incredibly charming, and I can confidently say she is one of the greatest instances of characterization in a video game, both at the game's release and today, 10 years removed. Courtney Draper's vocal performance is just magical, and the stellar animation work sells her as a real person, not a robotic entity like so many other NPCs. She and Booker riff off each other as they explore the city, and the game does a great job gradually evolving their relationship from wary strangers to trusted companions, and beyond into some really interesting places. Her character undergoes a full transformative arc that feels earned. I said earlier that Bioshock Infinite wouldn't work without Columbia, but Elizabeth might be even more vital to the game's identity and success. Just like with the Columbian Fair, I'm always disappointed when your peaceful time exploring comes to an end, and the game world turns hostile again. Elizabeth reacts the way you'd expect upon discovering her new companion is a total raging monster on the battlefield. She comes to terms with it as Booker teaches her an important lesson that she'll remember throughout the game. If you don't draw first, you don't get to draw at all. Soldiers Field is an expansion on Battleship Bay, with its glamorization of the Colombian military, but it has a far more interesting level design. I appreciate how open and large the area is, but the actual way it is laid out is baffling. It feels like a hub zone for some alternate open world version of Infinite. There is admittedly a lot of exploring to do, but that exploration already starts to feel hollow. After clearing an area of enemies, your first step is always to mindlessly comb the area for loot, like useless food, or if you're lucky, something as thrilling as silver eagles or lockpicks. This almost immediately grows tiresome, and we've only just started the game. More rewarding goodies like voxophones, this game's version of audio diaries, gear perks, or infusion upgrades, can be found just off the beaten trail at times, but are more often locked up. There are a couple instances of cipher puzzles, but these are poorly implemented and barely even worth discussing. Just find the code book and then return to the code, where an extremely simple puzzle is presented to you. Beyond these very limited instances, only 3 in the entire game, the levels rely on lockpicking to open up prizes and paths. Again, a really boring system. There is no interactivity at all. Liz handles the entire thing for you. At the beginning of the game, these lockpicks are quite rare, forcing you to be very thorough when combing through the levels. But at some point, this balance is totally lost, and I found myself swimming in picks, with nothing to use them on. With the combination of the vigor and tear systems I'll be discussing in detail later, surely some creative environmental puzzles could have been used instead. Both systems are relegated to combat alone. I'd love to see them get some use in the downtime as well. There is a wealth of possibility here that's just left totally untapped. I don't want to come across as too harsh because the game does make a concerted effort to use the setting for environmental storytelling. I wouldn't say it's nearly as successful as the earlier games, and it definitely begins to fall off as the game progresses, but it's still above much of the industry. Like I said, the real prizes for exploration are the voxophones. The best of these voxophones populate the world with side characters that you never meet, each living out their own ongoing stories in the background. One great example is Hattie Gerst and her husband Samuel. Samuel contracted cancer from his time working near the siphons on Monument Island's laboratory. Facing death, Samuel accepted an offer to be turned into a handyman. This life proved extremely unpleasant, but Hattie's love for her husband kept him going through all the pain and anger. Before she died, she left a recording of herself for Samuel to play whenever he was down, but losing her was too much to handle, and Samuel enlisted in the fight against the Vox, where he was killed. When you find his body, he is still clutching Hattie's gift. Another favorite of mine is the story of Preston Downs, a renowned hunter tasked by Comstock with tracking down certain Vox leaders. This guy does not mess around. Voxophones reveal that his thirst for blood was abruptly dried up when he accidentally captured a young Native American child in his bear trap and decides to turn a new leaf. These stories take place outside the main story threads, but the little touches in the areas where you locate each voxophone make you believe that they actually did take place in this world. Admittedly, I am cherry-picking the best stories here. Many voxophones just function as cheap exposition that fills in gaps from the main narrative. Obviously, I don't prefer that type of voxophone, but I do still love getting a better picture of who the main characters are outside of Booker's interactions with them. While Columbia is inarguably the star of the show, Bioshock Infinite puts more focus on its lead character, or in this case characters, than earlier games in the series. Jack and Subject Delta were clearly important in the context of their stories, but if I'm being honest with myself, they completely fade from my thoughts during normal gameplay. I don't really feel like I'm playing a character in Bioshock 1 or 2, rather just controlling a silent avatar. Contrast that with the two unforgettable leads in Bioshock Infinite. If Monument Island was dedicated to introducing Elizabeth, I think Soldiers Field's main function is to flesh out the Booker DeWitt that we control. Voiced all too recognizably by the prolific Troy Baker, Booker is far more complex than your typical leading man, and that largely comes down to the fact that he is not a hero. We're constantly reminded of how little regard he has for the countless Colombians he mows down, and it's easy to forget that he didn't set out on a rescue mission, but a selfish kidnapping attempt. Bring us the girl, wipe away the debt. During the Hall of Heroes segment of Soldiers Field, we are introduced to the first of several secondary antagonists in the game, Cornelius Slate. Slate is a military man, through and through, who turned on Comstock after hearing the falsified, sanitized records of battles he took part in. Comstock takes credit for fighting in the Battle of Wounded Knee and the Boxer Rebellion, which Slate claims is a bald-faced lie. I also think the introduction of motorized patriots in Colombia broke Slate. These machines trivialize the price he and his fellow human soldiers paid in battle. His troops instigate a fight with Booker in hopes of dying a glorious soldier's death. I love how the zones of Bioshock 1 and 2 would often feature a side character arc that would be explored throughout the level but resolved before you progress to the next. Steinman in the Medical Pavilion, Sander Cohen in Fort Frolic, Simon Wales in Siren Alley, Gil Alexander in Fontaine Futuristics. You get the picture. This is such an effective pacing structure that was very intelligently brought back for Infinite. Each larger-than-life personality gets time to shine, but never wears out their welcome. Slate's biggest contribution to the game's narrative is bringing Booker's past to light. Booker fought alongside Slate. The two actually seem to have been pretty close back in the day. The big difference between the two is that Slate celebrates their victories over the Indians and the Chinese, but Booker is suffocated by the guilt of the atrocities he committed in these battles. His anguish was so great, Booker even turned to baptism to wash away his sins, before changing his mind at the last second. A dunk in the river would do nothing to fix the broken man he is. The Hall of Heroes features life-size dioramas of Wounded Knee and the Boxers Rebellion, just like the Journey to the Surface ride from Bioshock 2. These are an awesome experience akin to the Disney Dark rides. All the pop-ups and noise that engulf the player really places them inside these fictitious versions of actual events that Comstock fabricated. You can tell going through these is torture to Booker, raising back up the dark past he's done everything to put behind him. Just when things were starting to look up for Booker, Elizabeth realizes he has no intent to bring her to Paris as promised, and the Vox overtake the airship he planned to escape Columbia with. The infamous Daisy Fitzroy arranges a trade, the assistance of the Vox in exchange for weapons. The gunsmith, Chen Lin, can be found in Finkton, the next big zone. As you might have guessed, Jeremiah Fink is the focus of this chapter. A Rockefeller-esque figure, Fink is a bigoted businessman who represents all the titans of the Industrial Revolution. He'll employ any labor exploitation trick you can think of, and does everything in his power to keep the minority workers in their place. His propaganda posters and PA soundbites are among the best in the series, a perfectly exaggerated version of what you absolutely would find in real-world factories of the time. I think of Fink as Comstock's unofficial right-hand man. He's careful not to rock the boat, and Comstock definitely values the effect his industry has upon the working class. One of Fink's creations is the Vigor, this game's version of plasmids. I'll go into the gameplay elements of Vigors in an upcoming, extensive combat-focused rant, but did want to acknowledge that they really don't fit the world of Columbia at all. Nothing about the city's ideology or Comstock's governance would imply that superpowers in a bottle would be something pushed upon the common folk. Plasmids fit perfectly among the unchecked progress and freedom of the individual mentality in Rapture. Even if this isn't the case in Columbia, I still can't imagine a Bioshock game without flashy powers on the left hand, guns in the right hand. It's so crucial to the series' identity to me that I'll willfully ignore whatever ludonarrative dissonance baggage that accompanies the Vigors. Going through the many subzones of Finkton always starts to drag in my experiences, and it's at this point that the simplicity of the level designs really begins to bother me as well. Each area does an admirable job at fleshing out Columbia and the story, however the praise ends there. There are a few exceptions in the opening hours, but as the game progresses, the levels grow linear to a fault. It was so much fun to get lost in Rapture, both in an immersion sense, but also in a very literal sense as it relates to the level design. Each zone was still explored in a linear fashion, of course. It's not like Rapture was an open world. But the complex, layered areas within would always challenge your mental map, and led to lots of satisfying backtracking. This is an exaggeration, but in Infinite it can sometimes feel like the straight paths connecting enclosed combat arenas are just copy and pasted with very little thought put into them. This is a floating city, characterized by dynamically changing infrastructure, for goodness sake. How can you expect me to be satisfied with such a linear path? Columbia is an incredibly unique setting in concept and story, but you just don't feel that in the level design. The game offers you a guidance arrow at the touch of a button, which is a nice feature, but it just reveals how limited the exploration is. The center square of Finkton has a few different paths you can go down when you first arrive. If you dare to not follow the arrow to Chen Lin's shop, and instead check out the neighboring Good Time Club, you'll literally be told to come again later once the narrative is ready. It's just insulting. Only once you discover Chen Lin has been arrested for his involvement with the Vox and is being held within the club can you enter. You find him dead there, and this is where Infinite's story starts to get crazy. Inspired by the words of the Lutesses, Elizabeth uses her powers over Tears to travel to a different Columbia, one in which Chen Lin is still alive. The game makes a strange emphasis on the disastrous effect being simultaneously dead and alive in different realities has on a person's mind. This is then almost immediately forgotten, which is for the best. If we're to believe what the game tells us, that there are infinite realities, everyone would be experiencing this effect, at all times. The introduction of a multiverse immediately throws countless plot holes into the mix, but thankfully my tolerance for these is pretty high. I'm able to suspend my disbelief to the extent where I can enjoy the wild ride the game takes me on. Others might not be able to. I've heard so many accounts of the plot holes in this game totally ruining it for some players. Of course that's a valid response, but it wasn't the case for me, and I don't want to dwell on it any further. Chen Lin might be alive in this version of Columbia, but at the cost of his tools. This fetch quest just doesn't end. They can be found in the Bull Yard in Shantytown, the slums where Fink's laborers barely scrape by. The only thing I really want to highlight here is that large parts of the area return to a non-hostile state. After how exciting the opening areas like the fair were, I expected the rest of the game to follow suit. Unlike Rapture, Columbia is still breathing, and I loved interacting with all of the citizens. The world felt alive. It was short-lived though, because after the raffle it feels like the entire world is hostile to you, and the only way to interact with it is through combat. At one point the game teases you with a hint that you can avoid combat in certain areas, but this just isn't the case in the game we got. It would be awesome if this feature was actually implemented in a meaningful way. The game desperately needs more non-violent contextual interactions with NPCs, who don't consider Booker an enemy until the player does something drastic. I yearn for more of these sections where you can just experience life in Columbia, but unfortunately Shantytown doesn't live up to that standard. The area is pretty desolate and there isn't much to do. There are a couple contextual moments like summoning food to distract a homeless crowd. This is a tiny instance that is barely worth mentioning, but when the game offers so few non-violent interactions with its world, it needs to be brought up. The game should be absolutely packed with these to the point where they feel natural and just part of exploring Columbia, not one-offs where the game breaks from business as usual. There is one sterling example I want to show to demonstrate what I'm talking about. This tender moment where Elizabeth comforts a scared child with song has nothing to do with the story, and takes place in a random basement players could easily bypass. It stands out so strongly because the game never does anything even close to this again. Imagine if this sort of moment was just one of countless organic ways you experience the game's world. Columbia and its inhabitants would come to life on your screen.
Will the circle be unbroken by and by, by and by? Is a better home awaiting in the sky?
We jump through yet another tear to a reality where the Vox got their weapons and have launched their assault on Fink's factories, but with the twist that the Booker of this reality died for the cause. Fighting alongside the Vox as allies is a nice change of pace, but doesn't last too long. Booker's martyrdom was a great rallying point for the Vox Populi, and Daisy doesn't take too kindly to our Booker complicating the narrative. It's a pretty jarring transition from Fink as the defining antagonist of the area to Daisy. I'm assuming and hoping that most players would naturally side with the Vox Populi leading into this war, but once they gain the upper hand, their true colors are revealed. Their reign of terror is as brutal and inhuman as the power they sought to overthrow. This could definitely work as an illustration that things are never as simple as they appear, but the Vox and Daisy's sharp turn from freedom fighters to terrorists doesn't feel earned. I get the impression that a chapter is missing where you learn more about the Vox Populi's specific beliefs, beyond just anger at their oppression. Daisy murders Fink, and was intent on killing his innocent son as well, until Elizabeth stepped in. We need more context into how she turned so violent for that turn to feel natural. As a housekeeper in Comstock's house, she was framed for the murder of Lady Comstock, and has been hunted ever since, so her quest for revenge is understandable, but the extents she goes to in punishing the Founders Party feel far in excess of the crime. It's a shame the game does her so dirty by turning her into a child killer like this, because I do really love the charisma and delivery behind her performance. This is a major turning point in Elizabeth's arc. She was only barely able to tolerate Booker's killing before, and now she finds her own hands soaked in blood. What better way to illustrate a character transformation than with an outfit change? It's really on the nose, and I just find stuff like this kinda cringy. Yet again, our airship is attacked before we can use it to escape Columbia. The plot really has lost any forward momentum. We're just treading water at this point. We land in Emporia, the home of Columbia's upper class, and set our sights on Comstock House. While I love the look of this area, its layout is really annoying. The main downtown section is a massive loop that once again punishes the player for exploring areas outside the prescribed order. This might give the appearance of a complex level structure, but it's only skin deep. Curving a linear corridor back on itself does not make it any less of a linear corridor. In the absence of interesting level design, let's follow Infinite's example and turn to combat. This whole level is dominated by large combat arena encounters, so I figure it's time to finally get into that promised combat rant. If a nitty-gritty breakdown on the way guns, vigors, and gears are utilized in combat doesn't interest you, feel free to skip ahead to the next timestamp. Still here? Awesome. For better or for worse, combat is the primary way you interact with the world of Bioshock Infinite, so we really need to discuss how effective this game's systems are in that regard. Fair warning that this section is going to sound very critical. I think Bioshock Infinite functions perfectly well as a stock run-of-the-mill shooter with a couple of its own gimmicks. It's all completely competent, and if that's all you're seeking, then great. For me, Infinite misses the mark in many areas, especially when you frame it as a Bioshock game. The prior games in the franchise didn't follow any trends, and actually had kind of awkward gunplay at times, but were shining examples of open-ended and creative combat design. The game's overwhelmed you with options in combat, and it's here where Infinite disappoints. The most obvious downgrade is that Infinite only equips you with 2 guns at a time. Compare that to the expansive arsenal Bioshock 1 and 2 allowed you to hot swap between to your heart's content. I really can't come up with any explanation for why this limitation was implemented, because it doesn't even make sense with the rest of the mechanics of combat. For one, there are way too many guns in the game. 13 by my count. This is split into 6 core guns that will be your bread and butter: the pistol, shotgun, machine gun, carbine, hand cannon, and sniper rifle. These 6 weapons are all suitably differentiated from each other, and form a great lineup that can handle pretty much any situation you might find yourself in. Then you've got a selection of heavier weaponry that is much scarcer and only really suitable for certain encounters: the crank gun, RPG, and volley gun. Generally, these items are only obtainable after defeating a difficult enemy, or during larger encounters where they will be put to good use. Finally, there are a collection of redundant guns that offer small modifications to those mentioned prior. For example, the heater deals one massively damaging shot that can also ignite its target, but must be reloaded between each shot. It fills the same role as the shotgun, but with a bit of a twist. You also have the repeater variant of the machine gun, the burst gun which modifies the carbine, and the hailfire which is based off the volley gun. The game contextualizes these variants as the Vox versions of their counterpart weapons, but there is no reason to think the Vox couldn't just use the same weapons as the Founders. No new weapon niches are satisfied with the addition of these filler guns. There is so much redundancy in this lineup that I would propose nixing all 4 of these extra weapons. Then, by allowing the player to carry the 6 core guns at all times, the freedom of combat that was present in the prior games would be restored, without overloading the player with options. I'd compromise and define the 7th item slot as your heavy weapon, which could only be filled by one option at a time. So you could be running around with the RPG, but then when you pick up a crank gun off a fallen motorized Patriot, you would drop the RPG until you find another one. This system would approximate the equipped weapon count in the Rapture games, but would still trail behind them in combat options, because each of these guns only has 1 ammo type, instead of the 3 from Bioshock 1 and 2. These different ammo types often totally transform the weapon in question, so losing them is a major step down in available options. Even so, I don't think that anyone would argue that this system I just outlined is vastly superior to the implemented 2-weapon system, and would be incredibly easy to put in place. The game has a weapon upgrade system that encourages specializing in your favorite guns, which also flies in the face of the 2-gun system. What's the point of upgrading your machine gun if you're going to be dropping it the second it's out of ammunition for whatever else is lying around? And if you do fully upgrade it and choose to predominantly use the machine gun whenever possible, you're going to be spending the entire game running around looking for ammo. Enemies will drop ammo from the entire 13-weapon pool, so it can be unreasonably difficult to find what you need for your currently equipped weapon. Every other combat mechanic is trying to push the player into swapping disposable weapons out with whatever's available on the fly, which makes the upgrade system feel incredibly tacked on. It conflicts with the intended playstyle. The redundant weapons are made even more useless by weapon upgrades. They don't start appearing until the second half of the game, after you've already got a couple upgrades on the base guns that they are ripping off. The base repeater isn't any stronger than the base machine gun, so why would you even bother with it when you already have a fully upgraded machine gun? Furthermore, none of the weapon upgrades on offer are interesting at all. There isn't a single option that goes beyond more damage, larger clip size, less recoil, and the like. The upgrades in Bioshock 1 and 2 didn't really venture too far into creative territory either, but the aforementioned alternate ammo types were staggered throughout the game, which offered a similar impression of progression. Just look at the proximity mines or heat seeker ammo for the grenade launcher in Bioshock 1. These open up radically different and exciting playstyles many hours into the experience. Furthermore, the actual upgrades in Bioshock 1 and 2 felt like much more of an event, as they were limited to a few power to the people stations throughout the game, and would actually visually change the on-screen display of the gun in fun ways. It was legitimately exciting to find an upgrade station because they were exceptionally rare. The choice of what to upgrade was always a difficult one. In comparison, coughing up a couple hundred Silver Eagles at a random Minuteman's armory shop to add 25% extra damage, with no visual change, to the carbine that you're probably going to be dropping in the next fight anyway, is incredibly unsatisfying. The way Infinite handles its guns is a total letdown from Bioshocks 1 and 2, but maybe that's because the plasmid system is enhanced in this new game. Now you may be surprised to hear that I actually do consider Infinite's use of vigors in combat to be the strongest in the series, with some reservations. It isn't as roaring a victory as it might first appear. There are 8 vigors in Bioshock Infinite that are slowly doled out, and, shockingly, can all be carried simultaneously. This makes the 2-weapon system even more baffling. The player is trusted with managing 8 vigors simultaneously, but more than 2 guns is out of the question? This actually matches Bioshock 2's maximum count, and surpasses Bioshock 1's, which capped out at 6 plasmid slots. Off to a good start. So what kind of vigors do we get to play around with? Let's go through them one by one. Possession is the first vigor players will unlock, and it allows you to convert machines to your side. Hacking isn't present in Infinite, so this is basically the replacement. An upgraded possession can also be used on live enemies, which fills the same role as the enrage or hypnotize plasmids from earlier games. This is the kind of streamlining that I like to see. I don't miss hacking, and giving one tool multiple uses is always a great idea. My one complaint is that possessed enemies take significantly reduced damage when shot by the player, which is a baffling choice, as the natural response to a possession expiring would be to kill the target before it wears off. I'm going to group Murder of Crows and Shock Jockey together, as they accomplish very similar things, basically stopping the enemy in their tracks while doing a bit of damage. These are essentially Insect Swarm and Electroshock respectively, so you know what to expect. I don't really need to dig any further. Bucking Bronco is also in the same wheelhouse, but more interesting to me. It launches enemies up where they can be shot down like fish in a barrel. The enemies can't fight back while hovering like this, but they also won't be stuck in place like with the previous two Vigors. Targets gain momentum as they're shot, which makes aiming trickier, balanced out by the fact that Bucking Bronco can be used to flush enemies out of cover, an extremely attractive attribute. Devil's Kiss isn't as similar to Incinerate as you would think. It mostly just functions as a strong blast of damage in my experiences. Charge is pretty boring to me. It just launches Booker to a nearby enemy to hit them with a strong slam. If you've played Bioshock 2, you'll recognize this as Drill Rush, which was a core part of Delta's kit. It's nice that the ability returned because it really was fun, but it's not especially interesting as a repeat, and lacks the same satisfying impact when you aren't controlling a hulking Big Daddy. Undertow is a great new addition which can be used to push enemies away like Sonic Boom, but also pull them in from afar. Both of these uses are situationally very powerful. With how open the arenas of Columbia are, being able to pull enemies in from faraway airships to blast them with your shotgun is invaluable. There are also countless opportunities to conserve ammo by just pushing an enemy off a ledge to their demise. That leaves one Vigor, and I've saved the most problematic for last, Return to Sender. The main use has Booker collecting all the bullets shot at him into a ball, which can then be redirected at a nearby enemy for massive damage. Booker is protected from harm while doing this, but holding it longer than necessary will drain your salts meter rapidly. The problem lies with its secondary function, where a quick tap of the Vigor will produce a temporary shield, offering invulnerability from all damage for a few seconds. For how little salt this ability costs, it's incredibly powerful and trivializes most fights. You can easily just stand in front of a tough enemy and remain undamaged for half a minute or more, shooting them with everything you've got in the meantime. Thankfully, this is the final Vigor given to the player, near the end of the game. With an upgraded Return to Sender, you can choose to just not interact with the entire rest of the combat system, and that's a big problem. The 8 Vigors available are a decent selection, but far from a home run. Being able to hold 8 at once isn't quite as exciting as it sounds, because there is so much overlap. Basically every Vigor is either a stun, a distraction, or a shield. Only 3 of the 8 are substantially different from what was found in Bioshocks 1 and 2. Bucking Bronco, Undertow, and Return to Sender. I've already told you how I feel about Return to Sender. There are a couple of programmed effects you can achieve by combining 2 Vigors. These aren't explained at all and are left for players to uncover organically through experimentation. Unfortunately, I don't find them to be that extensive or powerful. Other than the novelty they offer, there really isn't much of a reason to combine them. Any benefit is counteracted by using up your salt meter twice as fast. Each Vigor also has a secondary charge effect, generally a trap variant, but with how open the arenas of Columbia are, you'll struggle to find effective uses for these traps. I got a lot of mileage from charging up Devil's Kiss trap and just throwing it into a group of enemies, but this isn't a creative new use for the Vigor, it's just me getting more bang for my buck. I probably went overboard here in nitpicking the Vigors on offer, because at the end of the day the Vigors do feel really good to use, and are a powerful addition to your arsenal, often overshadowing the effectiveness of guns. Their implementation is far from perfect, but far better handled than that of the guns. Before I totally leave the conversation of Vigors/Plasmids, I should mention that the tonics of earlier games, Plasmids with more passive uses, have been spun off into what is referred to as gear. First of all, the thought of equipping different hats and boots that you find to gain perks is beyond stupid, but looking past that to their actual gameplay use, they are a good inclusion. The effects you can gain aren't especially creative or exciting, but are varied enough to suit any playstyle. With so much of Bioshock Infinite's combat design lessening the player's options, I can't very well complain about a perk system that helps incentivize specialization. For example, if you want to focus on melee attacks or focus on Vigor usage, the gear system can offer tailored perks for both of those. I do, however, have a slight problem with a few gear items that are extremely overtuned to the point of making the game drastically easier. For example, Overkill will stun all surrounding enemies if you deal more damage than necessary to secure a kill, In practice, this ruins the balance of the game. Basically, every time you kill one enemy in a crowd, the entire crowd stops in their tracks so you can line up a headshot on the next, and then the cycle repeats. Most of the effects are nowhere near this powerful. The problem lies with the fact that gear is encountered randomly. Every time you find one in the field, it has a random chance to be either a piece of crap or something like overkill that threatens to ruin the game's balance for you. It sounds pathetic, but the fact is you can't trust players to realize they are ruining the experience for themselves. There's a great quote from the Civ 4 designers Soren Johnson and Sid Meier that basically says it is the designer's responsibility to protect the player from themselves, because given the opportunity, they will optimize the fun out of the entire game. I pity the player who found the overkill gear item right in Chapter 1, and never unequipped it the entire game. Thanks for indulging me on that rant, but there is far more to Bioshock Infinite's combat than a list of guns, powers, and gear. So let's dig into more of what makes it unique, and get a bit more positive in the process. First and foremost, Elizabeth is incorporated into combat in some very smart ways. It does require suspension of disbelief, but mercifully the enemies will ignore Elizabeth and focus all of their aggression on the player as Booker. Turning the entire game into an escort mission, where Elizabeth must be protected, would better match the story, but we all know that would likely turn the game into a miserable affair. Irrational took the easier and smarter choice of having her disappear to the sidelines in combat. She still offers a helping hand to Booker in two simple but effective ways. For one, she will toss Booker ammo, health, or salts, whichever is needed most, periodically on a cooldown. More interestingly, she can open tears and bring new elements into the battlefield. Options could include cover, access to high ground, new weapons, turrets, or even friendly allies. Both of these features are great ways to strengthen the player's bond to Elizabeth, but crucially don't go too far by cheapening her into a mechanic instead of a character, as was the case with Bioshock 2's Eleanor. My major criticism with the tears is that there isn't a cooldown on this ability too. The appeal of the tears comes from the element of choice. By picking one option, you should thereby be sacrificing the others, and personalizing the fight. Instead, in reality, you will summon the cover when you need it, then summon the pile of sniper rifles when you need them, summon the mosquito turret when you like, but then swap to the motorized Patriot after the turret is taken out. There is no permanence to your choices, and you can bring each tear into reality the second you need it, so they might as well all be present at all times. The simple change of making Elizabeth's tear abilities run on a cooldown, 30 seconds or so, would do wonders. I could still nitpick that the tear options repeat too much to the point of growing stale and tired, but I understand how difficult it would be to craft unique options for every combat arena. Although underutilized, the skylines are a wonderful idea and one of the best elements of Infinite's combat design. They fit the world perfectly. It just makes sense that a floating city with a bunch of disconnected islands would have a connective aerial railway system between them. Racing along the skyline just fills me with pure childlike joy. The way the camera swings as you clank along the tracks perfectly matches the feeling of a roller coaster ride. In particular, jumping between two tracks and getting that weightless sensation just before you clamp onto the rail is so perfect. Mechanically, they are a great addition as well. The combat arenas in Infinite are generally very expansive, with lots of verticality, so proper use of the skyline is essential for repositioning. It should be apparent that aiming from the skyline is difficult, but you are able to fire on your enemies from above, which raises the skill ceiling for players, never a bad thing. I don't typically like the regenerating health system found in most modern shooters, instead preferring a finite health pool with a reliance on health packs and pickups like in Bioshock 1 or 2, but I have to admit Bioshock Infinite makes it work. Technically speaking, your health doesn't regenerate, but a rechargeable magnetic repulsive shield which depletes prior to your health bar is effectively the same thing. Amid all the chaos in these large arenas, it's flat out impossible for all incoming damage to be both readable and avoidable to the player, so the regenerating health is a natural fit. The skylines are also an important ingredient in making this system work. When your shield runs out, you aren't forced to cower behind cover as it recharges. Instead, you can hop on the skyline and race to safety. Enemies have trouble tracking you while riding, so the skyline almost functions as cover itself. Only difference is it's actually fun. I shouldn't have to point out that zipping around the arena at high speeds, picking out your next target, is far more engaging than twiddling your thumbs behind a corner. The last defining element of the combat system is the enemies. What's here is great. The soldiers and Vox rebels react intelligently to your actions, and can be found employing all the different weapons in the game. I guess that is one upside of such a bloated weapon pool. I just wish there's more variety in non-standard enemies. Many of the Splicer variants in the Rapture games used plasmids against you, which differentiated each enemy type far more than a different gun would. In Infinite, the only time Vigors are used against you is in the firefighter enemies or the teleporting, sword-swinging Raven Zealots. The few heavy hitter enemies that are in the game, like the Handyman and the Motorized Patriot, are awesome and I would love more. Both are a healthy challenge, especially mixed in with more stock enemies, but more importantly they feature memorable designs. The Handyman recalls the Brute enemies from Bioshock 2, a hulking ape-like abomination built for manual labor. It's so unnerving hearing them scream in pain constantly, and the exposed organs are a great addition to the look. The Motorized Patriots fit Columbia's patriotic spirit perfectly, and sport endless quotability with their universally hilarious battle cries. The Lord judges, I act. We need more like these two. The game does have a couple one-off enemy types coming up shortly, but it's not enough. Neither the Handyman or Motorized Patriot fully lives up to the legacy of the Big Daddies, but combining them together with a couple more unique enemy types could have made up the difference. The Big Daddies from Bioshock were great fights, but the real reason everyone loves and remembers them so fondly simply comes down to how awesome their design looks. Memorable worlds should obviously be the chief concern when designing a Bioshock game, but memorable enemies shouldn't be that far behind. Combat rant over and back to Emporia. In order to gain entry to Comstock House, we must visit Lady Comstock's grave in order to trick the automated gatekeeper. I'll just say up front that I really hate this section. Somehow, Liz's powers bring Lady Comstock back as a ghost, and that cues a boss battle against the Siren. I said earlier that I'm able to suspend my disbelief with most of the hand-wavy explanations in Infinite, but this is the one point where it just goes too far. Where do ghosts fit into all of this? For as outlandish as they are, Elizabeth's powers are pretty well defined, and summoning spirits from the dead certainly does not fall within their scope. And then we get into the fight itself. The Siren doesn't throw out too much damage herself, but will fly around the graveyard and resurrect fallen soldiers infinitely. This isn't too oppressive during normal gameplay. It's certainly difficult, but you can whittle down her enough to finish the fight within a few waves. That balance does not translate at all to the game's hardest difficulty, 1999 mode. It's an absolutely ludicrous difficulty spike in an already tough challenge mode, and represents one of the most miserable obstacles I've ever faced in a video game. I know how terribly hyperbolic this comes across, but I'm serious. All of the problems with the game's combat come to light in this fight, but the chief concern is how scarce ammo becomes as the fight drags on and on. Your resources will be depleted rapidly, and aren't fully restored upon being revived, so it's very easy to effectively softlock yourself into the fight. The worst part? This Siren fight is repeated 3 times back to back in this level. After finally putting Lady Comstock's ghost to rest once and for all, Songbird swoops in to take Elizabeth back home. Booker chases her into a tear, and we enter the trippy endgame. This tear brings us into a future version of Comstock House, where Elizabeth has given up on Booker rescuing her and resigned herself to her destiny. The seed of the prophet shall sit the throne, and drown in flame the mountains of man. Bioshock's signature horror atmosphere returns full force here, with great ambiance and a spooky signature enemy type, the Boys of Silence. I honestly don't have much to say about these guys. They aren't offensive to me like the Siren, but I don't really care for their design either. The eyeless mask and funnel ears would make you think that you have to be quiet to sneak by them, but they actually detect you via sightlines. If you fail to sneak past them, the Boys of Silence will disappear and summon a horde of melee-focused lunatics. Really, they don't sport any significant gameplay difference from a standard security camera. Nevertheless, I am glad they were included, if only for this awesome jump scare that really got me the first time around. Old Lady Lisbeth sends us back to our Elizabeth, armed with the knowledge of how to control Songbird, so we can maybe actually accomplish something without getting interrupted. After the plot spent so much time just treading water, now it feels like we're rushing towards the conclusion. Important story revelations are just being thrown out like candy. When we do reunite with Elizabeth, She's almost unrecognizable. Escaping to Paris is no longer any concern. Now it's all about taking Comstock down for all he's done to her. The ensuing assault on the Hand of the Prophet, Comstock's ship, is nothing but combat for an hour or two. The end sections of the game really feel like just fight after fight with nothing in between. It reeks of filler to pad out the game length. Comstock is taken out in a great cutscene setting up the final reveals. Considering how terrible the Atlas fight was in Bioshock 1, I should be thankful that Infinite does not end in a boss fight, opted instead for a cinematic defensive stand against waves and waves of enemies. However, I somehow found a way to complain about this, too. After enduring what seems like endless combat encounters leading up to this fight, an even more drawn-out one is not what I wanted to see. But more importantly, I can promise you that every single player was expecting a climactic fight against Songbird here, and it never happens. This creature is an iconic element to the game and has been teasing us since we began playing, but we never received the payoff of actually fighting him. And this type of final boss fight carried no risk of tarnishing a character. I'm not advocating for a Comstock fight or anything so ridiculous, just a fight against the mascot monster. I seriously refuse to believe Songbird was conceptualized without the original intent being a boss fight. Instead, he functions identically to Eleanor in the final fight of Bioshock 2. You can summon him on a cooldown to aid against the waves of enemies. To say this is a disappointment is an understatement. That disappointment is immediately forgotten in the wake of the incredible ending sequence. To start, we get to visit Rapture again. It's unabashed fan service, but I adore the inclusion, no matter how brief it is. There is so much connective tissue between Columbia and Rapture, it just makes sense and had me grinning from ear to ear. Now that we are at the final reveals, I should say that I don't want this video to turn into a big Bioshock Infinite ending explained video. You can find hundreds of those on YouTube with big flashy clickbait thumbnails if you want, so I'll leave it to the professionals. There are two important bits. One, Elizabeth is Booker's daughter, Anna, taken from him by a sterile Comstock in a moment of weakness. And two, Comstock and Booker are the same person, two sides of a coin created by the branching decision he made by the waters of baptism. In order to actually destroy Comstock, and not just one iteration of him, Elizabeth had to tear up the roots, going all the way back to that baptism and drowning Comstock Booker. Fade to black. I won't pretend to understand every nuance of the bonkers story Infinite tells, but I will say that I am left profoundly satisfied. Yes, there are plot holes. Yes, there are loose ends. But for me, it works, and works wonderfully. This has to be one of the most creative and ambitious stories in the entire medium, and they pulled it off just about as well as you can reasonably expect. I adore these visuals of the infinite lighthouses with infinite Bookers and Elizabeths traveling down the same path, and the way the game zips you through time and space in this final sequence has me on the edge of my seat even though I've played this game many times before. While it disappoints me that Columbia starts to take a back seat around the time we start jumping through tears, narrowing the focus onto Booker, Comstock, and Elizabeth was definitely the right call. The ending to Bioshock Infinite feels so much more personal this way, just the relationship between two people across the multiverse. All of the twists are surprising but completely earned. If you replay the game, you'll be shocked at how much hinting and teasing there is, even from the very beginning. I found the endings to Bioshock and Bioshock 2 profoundly underwhelming, partly because they tried to bring choices into the narrative. There are a couple moments of choice in Infinite, like who to target at the raffle, which necklace Liz should wear, and how to deal with Slate, but it doesn't alter the final endpoint, constants and variables. Infinite sticks to one ending, but makes sure it packs a punch. The final sequence is the highlight of the entire game as far as I'm concerned. Closing comments. I want to once again reiterate that I adore Bioshock Infinite, no matter how negative some bits might have sounded here. It's a great game as is, but there is so much untapped potential, it could have been legendary with just a bit more work. Infinite had a very troubled development, filled with feature creep. It's been said that there was enough cut content to fill 5 games. It's clear Irrational and Levine eventually just had to ship a product, and you can tell where the game is rushed. The generic combat system definitely needed more TLC to live up to the Bioshock legacy. Later levels largely lack the special attention given to the initial few hours when Columbia brimmed with life and excitement. There is a 15-minute gameplay preview of a beta version of Infinite that I highly encourage you to check out if what I'm saying isn't clicking. I linked it here. Now you don't have to lecture me on the nature of vertical slices. They are rarely indicative of the actual product and are a marketing tool to showcase the best bits of the game. But hear me out. What if the game actually did play like this? You have to admit it's hard to remain completely satisfied with the game we played when your mind is opened up to what could have been. This footage shows us very dense locations with numerous intersecting paths that look like a joy to explore. It's filled to the brim with NPCs just living in the world, instead of immediately attacking you on sight. You get a much better picture of life in Colombia from these lived-in streets than the empty ones from the finished game. The Colombia on display in this beta is truly alive in a way that exposes how lifeless the shipped game can feel. There are also several contextual interactions in just these few minutes. I particularly loved the dying horse and the choice to euthanize it or attempt to bring it back with a tear. This gives so much character to Booker and Elizabeth and remains a really memorable moment to me, despite not even appearing in the game proper. And when the action picks up, the little taste of combat shown is way more dynamic than anything in the finished game. It just floods my mind with possibilities. I praise Bioshock for intelligently simplifying its predecessor, System Shock 2. Infinite further simplifies Bioshock, but at this point it's gone too far. The AAA spectacle dazzling the player is a slight mask for the shallowness of the gameplay, but the lack of substance is impossible to ignore. I enjoy the game tremendously, and there is enough Infinite does right that the game still succeeds in spite of its shortcoming, but it doesn't quite soar. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. If you're watching this now, that means you've already played a huge role in supporting me. Thank you so much. You guys have shown so much love to my little channel, and it really makes my day reading all your thoughtful comments. Keep them coming. I also wanted to give an extra special shout out to David Schmidt for financially supporting me on Patreon. This is above and beyond what I would expect from anyone, and I can't even begin to express my appreciation. This video was a little tricky to put together, simply because I have so many disparate thoughts on the game. I've played it 5 times at this point, and I have a really hard time parsing my opinions in a coherent way. At some points, I feel Bioshock Infinite is a genuine masterpiece, and at others I feel like it's a bit of a stain on the Bioshock name. Hopefully I was able to get my points across in a somewhat coherent manner. I would love to hear your feelings towards Bioshock Infinite, and see where on the spectrum opinion has landed on this game, 10 years from release. I'd also encourage you to give me any constructive criticism you might have. Don't worry, I can take it, and I want to continue to grow in these videos. The subject of my next retrospective will be The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, but I will return to Bioshock for Burial at Sea before long. Until next time, take care.